And we, the people, must not be seduced by speeches, by beautifully written plans. We need strict economic reforms. We need proper planning. We need cohesion. And we must demand this from our leaders. Unity is strength. And most of us are of the opinion that Africa must unite. So today I'd like us to reflect about what is standing in the way of a truly united Africa. Is it our foes or ourselves? Welcome to the Hearth of Thought. So the idea of a united Africa. I refer to it as an idea because it seems to be just that. So where did this spring from? I know most people would refer back to Kwame Nkrumah, and that would be correct. But the origin of a united Africa comes from Marcus Garvey, who in his 1924 poem titled Hail, United States of Africa, he brings out some interesting ideas about a united Africa. So I invite you to research and read the poem in its entirety if you're into poetry. But he was a prominent Jamaican political activist. He was of African descent. And the poem is not just important from this historical point of view, but it makes me question why I never read this, in primary school or in secondary school. Why isn't this part of our curriculum? Or at least where I'm from, we weren't taught this. So that would be the origin of, and I'll read the first stanza of the poem, and it says, Hail, United States of Africa, free. Hail, motherland, most bright, divinely fair. State in perfect sisterhood united, born of truth, mighty thou shalt ever be. You can read the full poem online if you just look up the Marcus Garvey 1924 poem entitled Hail, United States of Africa. So the proliferation of the idea. This wasn't until the independence period in 1957 where Kwame Nkrumah, who was the newly elected, the first democratically elected president of independent Ghana, who started advocating for and championing the idea of a United States of Africa. He believed that for Africa to truly achieve independence and development, its nations needed to unite both politically and economically. But as we all know, the single state model is no longer very popular due to obvious reasons. And we have several differences, although we're quite similar. Things like geopolitical divisions, societal differences, lack of political will, of course, and language barriers, and the multi-ethnic nature of the African people. So uniting Africa into a single nation or a single state is near impossible. And we must also interrogate the feasibility of that one Africa as a state or a nation state, right? Because Africa is huge and it is the second largest continent, of course, spanning 30 million square kilometers and a growing population. So although we have our similarities, although we have a shared history that brings us together, we must understand that there's an unfortunate impact of the scramble and the partitioning of Africa that has left us with our borders as we have them today. So an unpopular take on this would be that our empires and our kingdoms historically were never one to begin with. So the idea of a United States of Africa with a federal system is very unlikely and very unpopular, quite frankly, nowadays. So although we may not all agree with the exact blueprint that Nkrumah presented in his Pan-Africanist model, we must never relent in echoing that idea, because there are multiple other ways we can, should, and must unite. Not only because we share a common history, but I strongly believe that as Africans, we share a common destiny. So at the core of this shared belief is Pan-Africanism, right? So through the struggles of the sub-Saharan African people was birthed this spirit of, we have this struggle, there was slavery and then there was colonization. So again, that shared history that brought us together, and initiated or ignited in people the need to come together to fight what would have been, I guess, a common evil. So this sentiment is ever present. We've had transformational leaders like Thomas Sankara, who was a dedicated Pan-Africanist who envisioned a united Africa free from neo-colonial influences, believing in collective action and solidarity among nations. He advocated for a united front against death or against anything that would hinder African unity and freedom. And of course, we have a more modern approach to the Pan-Africanist movement. And I'm thinking of the proposal made by Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, who, upon being elected as the chairman of the African Union in 2009, told the Assembly of Leaders that, and I quote, he said, "I shall continue to insist that our sovereign countries work together to achieve the United States of Africa." Gaddafi had proposed a single African military force, a single currency, and a single passport for Africans to move freely around the continent. How interesting would it be for us to have a single passport? Is that feasible? Let's think about that. So, in response to Gaddafi's proposal, what did the leaders say? And, just to state the scene here, we are in 2009 when Gaddafi made this proposal. And this is about 50 years post-independence, post the 1960s. And that would have been the period that represented a golden age of high Pan-African ambitions as championed by Kwame Nkrumah. And even then, during Nkrumah's time, they weren't all united. Yeah, the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group. So we're questioning ourselves here to understand, what are our leaders really thinking when it comes to African unity? And what did the leaders say in response to Gaddafi in 2009? Did they all agree? You would assume that in this era, African leaders would be more broad-minded and more in line in thinking, right? No. So the assembly not only, they did not reject his proposal, but they said they would study it. Fair enough, right? Fair enough, they would study it and rediscuss a few months later. That was 16 years ago. And we all know what happened in October of 2011 to Gaddafi. And many people celebrated his downfall and complained that he had been intimidating African leaders. And people suggested that the African Union would function better without him and his repeated proposals for a unitary African government, which rightfully so, you would conclude that leaders would be against that. And to caveat on the Gaddafi story, we have what the mainstream media reported, and then we have the truth, right? And we see a pattern in the fate of revolutionary leaders like the likes of Nkrumah, the Sankaras of the world, and the Gaddafis. So, unity. Can we truly unite? Or better still, do we want to unite? Do our leaders want to unite? And this quest took me back to our recent conversation about, President William Ruto's speech at the UNGA. He talked about the institutions that the African Union was championing in an attempt to eventually achieve a one currency system, so that we can gain economic freedom, we can gain independence from, quote, foreign money. And his speech was powerful, and we shared it on this show. And I started looking deeper into it because I personally hadn't really heard about it. Of course, these are part of the Agenda 2063, the AU's 2063 agenda. But I looked further into these institutions, and then came my disappointment, because that's all it was. It was a beautiful speech. If there's one thing our leaders can do is deliver a strong speech, but where is the follow-through? Where is the follow-through? Again, big promises made by the African Union, but our leaders truly are anything but intentional about uniting the continent. It seems to me, at least. So where are we at? To fully understand, we need to go back to the OAU, which is the organization that precedes the African Union, the Organization of African Unity. And in 1991, that's 34 years ago, the Abuja Treaty came to life under the OAU. And the Abuja Treaty is officially the treaty establishing the African Economic Community. which was an agreement to promote economic integration across Africa, to aim, to create a single African economic community through a gradual process, and ultimately create, a wider free trade area, a common market, and a monetary union with a single currency. So that's the origin, right? 34 years ago at the OAU, and 3 major financial institutions were initiated: the African Monetary Fund, which is, like IMF, AMF. So the African Monetary Fund, with a purpose to facilitate integration of African economies by eliminating trade restrictions and providing greater monetary integration. So as envisaged under Articles 6 and 44 of the Abuja Treaty. So from 1991, the AU adopted the AMF Protocol and Statute at its June 2014 summit. So 1991 under the OAU, June 2014 under the AU, the protocol was adopted, creating the AMF. And the capital is $23 billion. So where are we at with this? The protocol would enter into force, and this is directly from the AU's website, 30 days after ratification by 15 member states. And as of 2017, 9 member states have signed the protocol, and none had ratified it. And the agreed time frame under the Agenda 2063 for establishing the African Monetary Fund is 2023. We are in 2025. The headquarters will be in Yaoundé, and let's pause for a second there, because signing a treaty, talking about the idea, and ratifying a treaty are different things, right? So you can sign as a preliminary step to express intention, but it's nothing binding, right? No country is held by any of the things in this treaty. And ratification, on the other hand, is more formal, right? We make the treaty legally binding, and thus, obliging the countries to comply with its provisions. So where are we at? The protocol enters into force 30 days after ratification by 15, that's 54 countries, 15 member states, right? And as of now, 9 have signed. So to answer our earlier question, are our leaders intentional about unity? Okay, that's the AMF. Next off, we have the AIB, the African Investment Bank, and the African Union adopted the African Investment Bank Statute at its July 2009 summit, right? The same 2009 when Gaddafi was chairman of the AU. And the AIB protocol and statutes would enter into force again 30 days after ratification by 15 member states. And as of 2017, 22 member states have signed and 5 have ratified the African Investment Bank: Benin, Burkina Faso, Congo, Libya, and Togo. And the agreed time frame under the Agenda 2063 for establishing the AIB is 2025. We are in 2025. And the headquarters should be in Libya. Finally, we have the African Central Bank. The establishment of the ACB will be based on the Joint African Union Commission and the Association of African Central Banks. So the strategy was adopted in 2015, and the agreed time frame for this under the Agenda 2063 is between 2028 and 2034. And the preparations for the African Central Bank will be made through the African Monetary Institute, which is expected to be established before the ACB. And the proposed headquarters will be in Abuja, Nigeria. And there's other institutions that the AU is championing, like the Pan-African Stock Exchange, intended to create a stock exchange, pretty much a unified stock exchange for the continent. And of course, we have the African Development Bank, as we all know, the African Export-Import Bank, a Trade and Development Bank, and you get the gist. So from 1991 under the OAU to the AU's Agenda 2063, there's a phased approach of 34 years of implementation of these institutions. Timeline set, clearly not being met, mainly due to delay in the ratifications. Why is this important? Why is it important as we discuss the unity of Africa? Well, because for us to emerge, we need capital, as simple as that. We need robust financial institutions to accompany countries in the industrialization efforts. So where is the Pan-Africanism we all speak about? Where is the unity we all talk about? And, we're still separated by promises made by our leaders. Where is the unity? And I understand there's, a lot of things that come into play for countries to decide to engage and ratify such treaties, but these are things that they're agreeing upon, right? They're sitting together, having the conversations and tell each other, well, these will come into effect 30 days after 15 people, 15 nations ratify. And few years in and 5 countries, no country ratifies a treaty. That was something that, was quite disappointing the more I looked into it, because the more our countries develop individually, the less likely unity will be a reality, because trade, connectivity, and the differences in our levels of development will further divide us, right? Because we're thinking of an Africa that trades together, that is connected through road networks, airways, right? But that's not what we're seeing on the ground. And countries are gaining different levels of economic development, and rightfully so. But the more we advance with separate strategies, or at least not in a cohesive manner, the more difficult it would be to unite in the future, because, well, each country is going to want to protect its own interests. And do you think that countries doing relatively better than others, both politically and economically, would agree to one currency which would weaken their trade potentials? That would be less likely, right? So with each country protecting their national interests, what do we think is going to happen? What do we think is happening and will continue to happen? But I think that's short-term thinking, because if we look at the broader picture and where Africa can head towards, if we unite, it's more beneficial in the long term, right? Maybe in the short term, there'll be some impacts that, some of the leaders are trying to avoid right now, but there's a longer growth vision behind this. And unfortunately, our leaders aren't as visionary, because imagine if Africa truly mobilized its own resources and invested in, say, industrializing our agriculture. Imagine the trade deals that we would have, not just intercontinentally, but also with the rest of the world. Africa trades, most African countries trade with China heavily. The rest of the world trades heavily with China. So imagine a market like, say, China, right? We industrialize our agriculture and we get to a place where we can have China as a major buyer, right? African countries coming together. Just imagine how much worth that would be in terms of US dollars. That would be in billions, right? So again, let's imagine for a second, we together industrialize our agriculture, right? Each country with its own advantage in different, crops, cash crops, food crops, right? And just imagine a market like, let's just take China, for example, and imagine a world where we're not only importing from China, but we're also exporting our, say, agricultural produce too. That's a huge market, right? And that would bring about fair trade, because we're importing, we're exporting, right? And the African continental free trade area will make more sense, will have more worth. And a single currency will have more impact, because there is trading activities happening from a more global perspective. So we must ask ourselves that, is it only about talking about one currency, or merely changing the name of the currency and agreeing that we must separate ourselves from colonial agreements? True, agreed. But diversification will ensure the freedom, will ensure a strong and valuable currency, because what makes a currency strong? A currency's valuation or economic value is determined by the forces of demand and supply. Is there a demand? Yes. Is there a supply? Question mark. There are other factors like interest rates, inflation, political and economic stability, trade balance, and the high demand for a currency, right? These are the things that would drive economic performance, and that would tell how much indebted a country is and how attractive it is for foreign direct investment opportunities. So these are the things that would naturally value a currency or increase the value of a currency. Of course, currency could be manipulated artificially, but the general rule is, high inflation and unstable economy, high unemployment would naturally decrease the value of a currency. So it doesn't suffice to say let's have one currency, but we need to have a valuable currency. And what does it take for our currency or our would-be one currency to be of high value. Over 30 plus currencies across the continent right now, and the currencies currently don't have any real value because most of them are pegged to other currencies, and we trade together in other currencies. It's interesting. When we look at, and I understand that the geopolitical stakes are high, because looking at the case of Zimbabwe, for example, and the horrible collapse of its currency was partly caused by mismanagement of resources and poor economic performance. On the one hand, of course, there was the land reform issues, but the overall impact was due to the impact on national production. And all of these things caused that hyperinflation in 2008, and we all know the historical $1 billion Zimbabwean dollar note, right? And inflation was galloping and the highest it's ever been. So, of course, there's the external interference that we must talk about, correct? And this was evident when, we saw what happened to Gaddafi, right? Because his proposal was that this currency be pegged to gold, allowing us to trade without relying on the US dollar, for example. And, the rest is history of what happened to him. And it's a history that has been distorted a lot. And it's important for us as Africans to understand the truth behind the idea of a united Africa and what's at stake for us. So capital accumulation is paramount. We must agree, right? And for the African industrialization plan to be any effective, we must be able to have that capital. It shouldn't be something that we're relying from elsewhere. The international financial institutions will not help us. Again, that makes me question the kinds of projects that are championed by, and mind you, most of these are long-term debts. So how our leaders consider defeat to this impossible world powers, right? And are they now simply enriching themselves because, after all, they can't change the system? That's what it looks like. But I strongly believe that if the leaders feel powerless because you talk to politicians and they tell you, well, you don't understand geopolitics, you don't understand what's at stake, you don't understand why this and why that. Okay, so if the leaders are powerless and us as the people fail to keep them accountable, then do we not deserve one another? I was listening to a podcast and I can't remember, the lady was saying, she said, Africans get the leaders they deserve, right? Let's digest that for a bit. Are our leaders in our image, or are we in the image of our leaders? Do we deserve one another? Food for thought, right? And the more we look into the state of play, the more we understand that the divide and rule strategy never truly ended. It just evolved. And today, with our resources, with our natural endowments, we're still very much not only divided, but we're not even thriving, right? So when we talk about Africa rising, for as long as I know myself, for as long as I've been alive, we've been talking about Africa rising, right? But rising to where? Rising to where when we import basic commodities, right? Let's talk about the urgent need for development, trade, investment, industrialization. But under these headlines lies a deeper question. Can we truly trade our way to freedom while we are divided and weak and dependent, while we have selfish leaders who protect their own interests? So why should we talk about this and talk about it and continue talking about it? Because leadership matters. Institutions matter, because we need reforms that work for Africa. We don't need imported templates. And we, the people, must not be seduced by speeches, by beautifully written plans. We need strict economic reforms. We need proper planning. We need cohesion. And we must demand this from our leaders. I was talking to a friend about this who nudged me to delve further into policies and what's working and what's not. What are the investment attractiveness looking like per country? And that was a good place to start my research. But the truth is, we never really lacked plans. We never really lacked policies. Most of our leaders are surrounded by by the best economists. Most of them hire Western economic firms to draft most of these plans. But the problem isn't in planning alone. The problem is in the execution, the follow-up. We need key performance indicators. We need to track within reasonable timelines. We need strict adherence to these policies. We need not just policies that exist on paper, but we need accountability in practice. So even though we talk about corruption lightly and say, well, everywhere else is corrupt, but the truth is that what is at the root of our corruption? Why are even people at the most individual level practicing this, are corrupt? Why is there poor follow-up? Why is there inconsistency in our leadership? Our system rewards loyalty to the powers and not resolve. And when our leaders fail, we rarely hold them accountable. Why aren't we building leadership where, based on results and accountability, checks and balances? What happened to all of this? And most countries have a anti-corruption organization or something similar, and that's just by name. That doesn't actually do any work. We need rigorous implementation of the reforms. So when we look at countries like China and most Southeast Asian countries, the rise wasn't just because they had good policies on paper. They had a radical implementation of their economic reforms with strict follow-up. Of course, they had incentives, but at the end of the day, they restructured from the ground up, opened their markets, prioritized manufacturing, built roads and power systems, and they didn't just write plans, they followed through decade after decade despite external pressure. And most importantly, when you look at the Chinese government, they invested heavily in discipline, follow-up, and of course there were incentives for progress. But what can we learn from that? Of course, without copying and pasting, because again, the Western model isn't for Africa, the East Asian model isn't for Africa. We need an African model that works for us and tailored for us. Of course, we can adapt to each country and the reality of each country, but we cannot keep outsourcing our development. I very much have no issue with us, working with other partners, but at the end of the day, we must invest in radical industrialization and manufacturing, and we must capitalize on our strengths in doing so. But what do we need for that? We need the capital, that's for sure. But most importantly, we need discipline. We need rigor in the implementation. Strict follow-up. So while the AAU's financial institutions have great goals, most that remain unimplemented today due to lack of willpower. What is it? Is it, personal interests that we're protecting? And to say to the people, well, y'all don't understand geopolitics. Well, tell me, are the Chinese, for example, more superior than us? Are they better humans than us? Because we're very close to coming to that conclusion, because if they can do it, and they're not superior humans to us, why can we not? Why does it seem to be such an impossible task for us as Africans, right? So, food for thought. Are we truly less off in one way or another? What is the issue with African thinking? And as financial institutions continue to fail us, focused on anything but industrialization, what are our leaders doing? And the truth remains that we need capital. We need to think from a capitalistic perspective, and we must incentivize and reward productivity, right? This could reduce corruption. We need to enforce strict accountability. I'm thinking right now, as this year most African countries had elections, or have or yet to have, and I see the rigor, right, around the electoral policies and the energy that the ruling parties bring forth. And I think, if you had just a third of that same energy to implement projects on a daily basis and to implement the rule of law in the country, we would be very far. And Africa is the youngest continent, but our policies feel quite ancient. We live in the modern world where skills, knowledge, technology is easily transferable and readily available, but we still behave like this is screw loose somewhere, right? And why? Because this is a copy-paste from colonial period, right? We're still thinking the way our masters taught us to think. Our leaders are still thinking the way the master taught them to think. And to move forward, what's the way? And what are the young people doing? Again, we can focus on leaders. That's a good place. But we, as this generation, are we learning any better? I'd like for Africans to agree on something simple. Our future will not be built by external saviors. It will be built by Africans alone. And the problems of yesterday, if we don't do that, will be rebranded as something else today. And of course, nations or partnerships with nations like China or Russia or the rest of the world is important. And the reason why most African countries like working with China is because they rarely interfere politically, right? And they're gaining grounds on the continent mostly from an economic perspective. However, there's a huge criticism of the Chinese influence on the continent, but I'm thinking, okay, that's fair. And that's a conversation we can have. But if we're thinking strictly from a capitalist perspective, right, from a profit-making, interest-based point of view, what do you think happens when you play with the big boys, right? Do you think you're gonna win and you're gonna or do you think they're gonna let you have a bigger share just because, well, you're younger? You know, do you think that's what's happening in the business or in the economic front? That's not what's happening. People protect their interests. People are not only power hungry, but they are money hungry, right? And in terms of gaining soft power and in terms of bargaining power, right, we can't always blame the exploiter, because at the end of the day, we live in such a world. So we must rise up for such a time as this. We must rise to the occasion. If we're not trading fairly with other nations, why? Because, well, we don't have a bargaining power. That's how it is. You go to the market. If your seller has a stronger bargaining power, you comply by the seller's rule. The seller will make the rule in the market. That's just how it works. So we can cry about it all day long, but at the end of the day, what is going to really fuel Africans is Africans. So at the end of the day, the only people we can count on is ourselves. We can only trust ourselves, right? We should be able to trust ourselves. We should be able to trust that if we're trading with each other, at least we're going to try to be fair with each other, right? And that doesn't seem like it's happening, because we can't even ratify treaties. We can't even, move forward with plans. And we're going to keep the same cycle. History is going to repeat itself. It's just going to look different. We're not going to be in chains like on the slave ship, but we're going to be in chains in other ways. So let's pause and reflect, right? Let's pause and reflect. And please comment in the comment section your thoughts and what you think about the obstacles to, the African unity as proposed by the likes of the Nkrumahs and the Gaddafis of the world. Are we our own enemies? And I really want us to have the colonizer debate, but let's think about what it is that we can do, right? Our leaders, we as people, we can hold them accountable. We can propose laws. We can lobby. Can we do that? And say, hey, this is what we demand. And are we our own enemies? Have we accepted that dependency is normal? Can we find the courage to rebuild trust amongst ourselves? Can the younger generation come together with a more united approach? Let's think about these things. And it's important because time is passing, generations are passing, and it will get to a point where, at least it's looking like to me, that even the younger generation are starting to have not very different mindset than their leaders. And that's very concerning to me. So thank you for watching. And please like, comment, and subscribe. Let's talk about these things. This is important. Let's not think that the conversations are not important, because they are, right? And let's grow a community of what I consider conscious Pan-Africanists. Thank you for watching. And until next time, take care.